Zoom is now live streaming.
I thought it could.
I'm going to go ahead and give Beth a call.
Okay.
Oh, hi. Okay.
We're streaming live, so anybody who doesn't want to be heard, please mute.
I think we're ready to go, Susan. It says
Are we ready to, are we live?
I think we are live.
Well, hi, everybody. My name is Susan Shelley. I'm the Vice President of Communications for the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, the most influential taxpayer advocacy group in California. And we are working through a couple of technical issues here with our hookups and our phone calls. And until we get everybody connected into the call, I just want to introduce you to HJTA President John Coupal to tell you a little bit about the organization and the PAC and what we're doing here today. John?
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you. We have a lot of members on, but if you're not a member of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association and you're concerned about the direction of California, we certainly encourage you to join our organization. Our mission statement is pretty straightforward. We believe in the defense of Proposition 13, and we advance all the rights of taxpayers in the state of California, including the right for limited taxation, the right to equitable taxation, and the right to efficient use of taxpayer dollars. And I think on that last point, wherever one may be on the political spectrum, it's important that whatever tax revenue that is generated in the state of California, that it is used wisely and not wasted. Unfortunately, we have seen too much waste of taxpayer dollars in the state of California. And it seems to us that every election cycle that comes around, we are confronted with candidates who give us not the kind of choices that we want. I think California is confronting some very, very serious problems right now. And what we're looking for is serious candidates to address those problems. So as the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association Political Action Committee was looking at the field of gubernatorial candidates, one name stuck out to us, and that was of Michael Shellenberger. We reached out to him and asked him to communicate with us and explain his vision of what he would do for the state of California. We were not totally ignorant of what he has done, being familiar with the books that he has published, including the seminal case on homelessness called San Francisco, which if you have not read that book on the homelessness crisis in the state of California, I strongly urge you to do so. So after talking with him several times, Michael Shellenberger did become the endorsed candidate for the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association Political Action Committee. And I think that did raise some eyebrows, as he is not affiliated with any party. He at one time was a Democrat, but the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association itself is a nonpartisan organization, again, simply seeking efficient, equitable use of taxpayer dollars and government transparency. So we were very pleased to see what he had to say about those issues. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether he is now on the online, but Susan, do we have whether or not we have a couple of people from his campaign on the line, and we are trying to figure out if there is if he is now online.
I don't see him on the call yet. Maybe Gabby can fill us in on where that stands, but we're gonna get everybody connected. And in the meantime, let me tell you that you can join the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association if you're not already a member. A lot of people don't know that this is a member-supported organization and that it runs on small donations of $15 a year from hundreds of thousands of Californians. And we are committed to protecting taxpayers. We're committed to protecting Proposition 13 and property rights. And we're committed to creating the kinds of policies in California that allow you to stay in California and allow your kids to stay in California. So if you're not already a member, or if you know someone who's not already a member, go to hjta.org and click join us and join this great organization and strengthen the voice of taxpayers in California. As you know, we'll work for you anyway. But if you join, you strengthen the organization and you make better policies in this state. So let me turn it back to John for just a moment. We'll see if we can get everything connected.
I'm not sure we paid the gerbils to run on the treadmill to keep us connected to the Shellenberger campaign. But what Susan said is correct. For those of you who are not familiar with the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, we have a number of different entities. We have the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Foundation, which is a 501c3 organization. And we have 2 political action committees. And also we do initiative committees as well. So we try to advance all the interests of taxpayers in no matter what forum that we may be in. Proposition 13 is the main reason that we advance what we do. And for those of you who were not around in 1978, Proposition 13 was the response to out of control property taxes in the state of California. People were literally being taxed out of their homes because of 2 things. Number one, very high property tax rates, as well as increasing property values. Under the old system prior to 1978, you were taxed on the value of your property. So in a hot real estate market, if the value of your property doubled in 1 year, so would your property tax bill. So Howard Jarvis proposed something very simple, and that is a flat 1% tax rate, which is very reasonable, and also a limitation on annual increases in taxable value. And property is reassessed to full market value when it changes hands. And for all the people who have said that Proposition 13 has starved local governments in the state of California, that's simply not correct. California ranks 14th out of 50 states in per capita property tax collections. And when it comes to tax burdens in the state of California, that's something else that I believe Michael Shellenberger will be well positioned to address. We already have the highest income tax rate in America at 13.3%. We have the highest state sales tax rate in America. We have the highest gas tax. In case you have been living under a rock, we have the highest gas tax in America, and obviously the highest fuel costs, highest corporate tax in the West, and by any measure, California is not doing well, even though this state is very beautiful. Many people want to stay and correct it, but we have 2 different Californians. We have a large number of very wealthy people, but we also have a lot of poor people, including the homeless. California, believe it or not, has the highest effective poverty rate in the nation when cost of living is taken into effect. We have a higher poverty rate than the state of Mississippi. And I think serious people need to look at these issues and look for candidates who are willing to not campaign by bumper sticker, but who have serious solutions. And that again is one of the reasons we are endorsing him. We are not sure where we heard anything else from the Shellenberger campaign.
I don't know, but while we're waiting, let me just tell you a little bit about his energy policies and why we think that's so important for California taxpayers, ratepayers, and residents. As you know, we are persistently in a condition of drought, and we are persistently in a condition of water scarcity. And just this week, the California Coastal Commission said no to a desalination plant in Huntington Beach that's been in development since 1998. That company has been jumping through hoops since 1998, dealing with all the different government officials and all the different regulations and all the different groups that wanted them to do things. They jumped through every hoop they had to jump through, and then the California Coastal Commission said no. In the middle of a drought emergency, with Southern Californians being told that they can't water a lawn and they have to cut back even further, In Los Angeles, we've never been released from the restrictions in the last drought, and they're starting to grind us again on this. Well, there are other policies. There's desalination, there's water storage. There's a number of water storage projects that voters approved in 2014. They approved $2.7 billion in Proposition 1, I think it was, for a number of water storage projects. Not one of them has been built. Why? Why has not one of them been built? Because the existing government doesn't prioritize the human use of water. Unless you're a fish, they don't really care about you. And they don't really care about your children. And they don't really care about your farms or your food or anything that you need water for, like living. They don't care. Well, it doesn't have to be like this. And so one of the reasons that Michael Shellenberger's campaign is so compelling is that he is anti-scarcity on water and also on power. Because if we were using nuclear power, we would not be needing as much imported electricity. Did you know that California leads all states in the import of electricity? Well, it doesn't have to be like this. We can generate electricity in California with nuclear power, and we can avoid the worst aspects of climate change. We can avoid contributing greenhouse gases to the environment with diesel generators and other types of things like that. We don't have to do it that way. So you can read Michael Shellenberger's book, Apocalypse Never, about why environmental alarmism hurts us all. And you can judge for yourself whether we have policies that make sense for the future of California or whether we need to go in a new direction. And so in addition to energy and water and homelessness policies, where does Mr. Shellenberger stand on taxes? Tell me about your conversation with him about taxes.
Well, first of all, we are 100% satisfied that the protection of Proposition 13 would be at the top of this list, including he made it very clear that any attempt to split off various property owners from the protections of Proposition 13 would be a non-starter with him. When it comes to taxes, he has made it also very clear that California is overtaxed. One of the reasons why California not only lost one representative in Congress after the last round of census, when the Census Department divides up the representatives in Congress, California lost one representative, and Texas and Florida each picked up at least one. So that is the result of demographic shifts of large numbers of people leaving the state of California, where they can have a better life in states that you wouldn't think would be better than the state of California. This is a beautiful state, and people who are moving from the Bay Area to Houston, Texas, sure aren't going there for the weather. It's because they have more economic opportunity. What we have seen and what the studies seem strongly suggest is that there are many demographics of people who are very frustrated with the state of California. As I mentioned earlier, California has the highest income tax rate in America at 13.3%, and we're competing against Nevada, Texas, and Florida, and other states where the top marginal income tax rate is zero, no income tax at all. So for high wealth individuals, obviously there's a huge penalty to be paid if you stay in California, but it's not just the wealthy. The middle class has been gutted. Obviously, we have a large number of poor who have a safety net that may or may not be adequate, but it's the middle class that we've seen moving out of the state of California. You talk about people who have a skilled trade, mechanics and carpenters, who can't afford rent in California, but they can afford to buy a house in other states. So we're seeing this demographic trend. And again, California last year actually lost population. For the first time since 1849, when we became a state, California actually lost population. So many of the policies that Susan was just talking about, they sound good. And this is one of the reasons we've been so frustrated with the political system here in California, is that we have politicians from both parties talking about what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and they do it in sound bites, and they do it in without explanation. They just say, "Elect me. I'm going to fix things." Well, if you've read any of Michael Shellenberger's books, you understand that he has done a deep dive into these most serious problems here in the state of California, including the homelessness issue. It is clear that California spends more on homelessness than any other state in the union, even on a per capita basis. And yet for every dollar the state of California spends on homelessness, the problem gets worse. And the reason for that is everything we're trying to do is counterproductive to the problem. And this is also true in the environmental realm. Many of the environmental solutions brought to us by the existing political class is actually making the environment worse. Let's just take one example. The environmental extremists have railed against any harvesting of timber in California for many years. Very difficult to get a timber harvesting permit. And what has that resulted in? Is resulted in some of the worst fire disaster, forest fires in the state's history. This was a completely preventable problem. Also, when it comes to transportation, the failure to accommodate the needs of a growing population has resulted in a massive gridlock on California's major freeways. For those of you who may be in the Los Angeles area, if you're familiar with the 405 freeway, 7 or 8 lanes in both directions, do you know how much carbon dioxide and other pollutants are being produced when the traffic is just stopped at a dead stop? So a lot of what California does is counterproductive to the problems we actually have.
Well, tell us about the bullet train and how that was going to save the environment and stop the traffic. How'd that work out?
Yeah, that's one of that. Okay, so you're trying to get me to go on a rant again. This has been a very sore subject, not only for me but for this organization. Prior to the bullet train appearing on the ballot, the bond measure, we, in conjunction with the Reason Foundation, compiled a study well over 200 pages with some of the nation's best transportation experts as to whether or not the bullet train would be viable. And in fact, one of the study's authors was a big pro-rail guy, a former vice president of Amtrak, and who nonetheless said that the high-speed rail project would not be viable. And so voters had the warning that this project was not viable, and yet we have spent billions of dollars on a project that not only will never be completed as envisioned, if ever, or and as well as producing massive amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. So I finally see, Michael, we hope that
Sorry about that. My apologies, John.
That's okay. Let me give you a formal introduction. And thank you for being with us. And sorry for the technical difficulties. Michael Shellenberger is an author and a journalist and the founder and president of Environmental Progress, a nonprofit research organization. He's the author of 2 best-selling books about solutions to California's problems: Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All, and San Francisco, Why Progressives Ruin Cities. He is an independent candidate for governor, and he has the endorsement of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association PAC. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Michael Shellenberger.
Hey, thanks. Good to be with you all. And my apologies for being a little bit late.
No problem. Why don't you, there's many things that we could talk about, but as you and I have discussed before, Michael, so many of these problems, these very intractable problems in the state of California, are interrelated. You can't talk about crime without talking about transportation and what's going on with BART and people not riding BART. You can't talk about crime without talking about homelessness, and you can't talk about homelessness without talking about the addiction problem. So I know that you've come to this with a more global approach, and why don't you give us your vision for California, and also tell us why the existing political class has done such a poor job in representing the interests of California citizens and taxpayers.
Well, that sounds great. Well, thank you again very much. It was a huge honor for me to receive the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association endorsement. I've been bragging about it on many of the interviews and phone calls that I've been on ever since. So my broad view is that California, it needs to grow up, and that we are in a state of evolution similar to the country, and that we need to move beyond a kind of left libertarian ideology to something that takes responsibility for our problems. And I can see this lack of willingness to take responsibility at all levels of government, certainly at the top with Governor Gavin Newsom, but I think it trickles down to all parts of the society, including to voters. So just to take, the big issue facing the state, the one that I think we're going to win on, the one that matters the most to voters, this issue of homelessness, it's really a matter of taking responsibility for what is fundamentally an untreated mental illness and addiction challenge at the state level. I'm not the first one to come to it, but other people have as well, that we don't think that this is a problem that can be solved at the county level. Some people say, we don't need another big government program. And what I point out that we're arguing for is essentially to reduce the number of government agencies involved in addressing the psychiatric and addiction crisis from 58 counties. We have 58 separate counties offering duplicative and wasteful and inefficient treatment to a single statewide system called CalPsych. At the same time, we need to have a statewide ban on camping. It's not safe for people to sleep outside. It's not safe for them. It's not safe for us. And we can get people into the facilities they need, including shelter, but it needs to be statewide. So one thing we see is that people come from around the United States. I'm interviewing people. It's probably 50 to 75% of the folks on the street are from out of state or from outside the city. And people often need care that isn't available in their local area. So first, it's really a move for, CalPsych, shelter first, housing earned, and then law enforcement, enforcing existing laws. It may be that we need to expand conservatorship or expand ways that people can get their mentally ill loved ones or addicted loved ones into the care they need. But we just need to start enforcing laws, because we discover that if you don't enforce laws, people don't follow them. And it's also a way for people to get the help they need. So we are finding people that are breaking laws multiple times, often misdemeanor laws, public camping, public defecation, public drug use. They're not being arrested. And that is an opportunity to get them the care they need. So the idea is that we can come in and make immediate progress to address the crisis through a disaster response. If we had 200,000 people on the streets of California from an earthquake, almost all of whom are suffering some sort of illness, we would have an immediate response. And then that response, in our view, can then turn into CalPsych. So that's the homelessness, drug crime crisis. When it comes to education, we view the most important thing is expanding parental choice. We know from Florida and other states that when parents have more choice over where their kids go to school, we get better outcomes, we get better performance, bringing competition into schools. And then on energy, water, housing, we have an abundance agenda. We know that in order to reduce the cost of living, make energy, water, and housing more affordable, we need to have more of them. And so we need to have an abundance vision. There is no reason for there to be a conflict between farmers, residents, and anyone else over water, and conservationists. We can create abundant fresh water. We can build the storage facilities that we need, and we can recycle water and desalinate water with abundant energy. And the problem is that the governor's been in the pocket of pro-scarcity environmentalists. I'm a pro-abundance environmentalist. There's really pro-abundance, pro-scarcity environmentalists, pro-human, anti-human. On the pro-abundance, pro-human side, we know you need abundant energy to create abundant fresh water. And we also know we need abundant housing. And in my book, Apocalypse Never, I describe this history of really trying to make energy, water, and housing more scarce as a way to reduce the population in California. And I think that even speaks to some of the of a childlike view of California. I mean, those of us that come here, I think we love it so much. And certainly in the earlier generation, people wanted to kind of keep California to ourselves. I think there's a more adult way to view this. And some people asking, I can see on the in some of the questions, how do we get this done? On some of the big initiatives, I think we need to build public support, build public consent outside of the legislative process. And I'm inspired in part by what I've seen in South Korea, what we call citizen juries, where we can impanel a group, a randomly selected representative group of California citizens to be part of a citizens jury to basically deliberate over a 9-month period across California to come up with solutions on housing, energy, water, and education in particular, so that when we do go to Sacramento, we do put this forward in a legislative context, that it would be much harder for the special interest to kill it. And even if they do kill it in the legislature, we can then put it on the ballot in November 2024 for voters to vote on. So I think that provides a bit of an overview. I should just say on the big issue on taxes, we need tax peace. I don't think anybody that looks at the way California does taxation thinks that we have a particularly sensible system of taxation. What's clear is that taxes are too high. If they weren't, we wouldn't have a $100 billion budget surplus this year. We have the highest sales tax, highest income tax, highest gasoline taxes. We're overtaxed, but I'm proposing tax peace for now. We need to get into office and be able to sort through all the different ways. We need to solve these big crises before I think we can get to any sort of agenda of tax reform. So let me stop with that, John and Susan, and open it up to questions.
Okay, well, someone asked, Walnut Watchdog asked, did you speak out during the recall? And why don't you tell us a little bit about your conversations with Gavin Newsom and how you happened to decide to get into the race at this time?
Sure. Well, so I did support the recall last year. I am not a huge fan of recalls in general, but I felt like the situation was so dire that I did support the recall. I looked at the candidates and I endorsed Kevin Faulconer. I actually campaigned with Kevin for a while. I had every expectation that he was going to run again. And so the reason I didn't get into the race until very late was because I was waiting for Mayor Faulconer to get in, and then he decided not to. And so we got in too late to get on the voter guide. A lot of people have been asking about that. We are on the ballot, have no fear, but too late to get in the voter guide. And I think a lot of people with the recall, including myself, wanted to send a message. They wanted to shake up the status quo. The problem was Larry Elder, who became the front runner, was so identical to Trump in his basic worldview. He didn't really have I thought, a well thought out, I think he was a super nice guy, by the way, but did not have a very well thought out strategy to deal with the homeless crisis. You know, at one point, Larry was in favor of decriminalizing drugs. He also talked about working with churches and charities. He didn't have a view of how to change the delivery of psychiatric and addiction health care. So for me, I think what happened is that the recall went from being a referendum on Governor Newsom to being a referendum on Donald Trump and Larry Elder. And that was, I think, a big part of the reason that it didn't work. We believe that this year, if we come in second on June 7th, it will be a chance to more directly challenge the governor on a set of the policies that I think that we have the will of the people with us. You know, when we did polling for our campaign, we found that we were receiving a third of support from Republicans, a third from independents, and a third from Democrats. That's a very unusual situation. For the most part, people remain highly polarized. But the basic vision of dealing with the homeless crisis that I just described is actually hugely popular. It gets almost 80% support among Democrats, 70% support among Republicans. So we feel like we're in a strong place to really challenge the governor in November if we can get past the June 7th primary.
Okay, while we're on the subject of Democrats and Republicans and independents, Kathy asks, you're a lifelong Democrat. Should she be leery of that? As someone who's not a lifelong Democrat, should she be leery of that?
Yes, well, I think you should be leery of everything. It's good to be leery. Yeah, I mean, what can I say? I was a lifelong Democrat. My history is that I worked on progressive issues in the 1990s. I then focused on the environment starting in around 2000. In 2010, After having advocated for renewables, I became convinced that renewables could not power, at least weather-dependent renewables could not power a major industrial economy like California's or the United States. I ended up looking at nuclear power. I changed my mind about nuclear power. I've become well known as an advocate of nuclear power for the last 10 years. I then looked at a whole set of other issues to consider where I might have been wrong. You know, I'm 50 years old now, so and I've had the chance now to do 2 books. You can see Apocalypse Never in San Francisco. And Apocalypse Never is a book that goes through the big environmental issues. I try to take responsibility. You know, this has been a theme that I mentioned at the top of the call. Try to take responsibility for my things I was wrong about in the past. And so Apocalypse Never goes through the evidence on climate change, renewables, nuclear power, meat, plastics, and looks at, you know, the real record on environmental trends, which I think is much more positive than most people realize. That book became a bestseller. Apocalypse Never has now been translated into 17 languages. And when that happened, I had a chance to do a second book. And I had become concerned about this issue of drug addiction, homelessness. In 2017, when drug overdoses reached 70,000 in the United States, up from 17,000 in the year 2000. So a huge increase, 17,000 to 70,000 over 17 years. I asked myself whether we had gotten that issue wrong, whether I had gotten that issue wrong. And so when I had a chance to do a second book during the pandemic after 2020, it was obvious to me that I wanted to take a look at these earlier views that I had held around drug policy, mental illness, homelessness, housing. And that's why I wrote San Francisco. And so this is a long way of answering your question. After I finished San Francisco in the spring of last year, I did 2 things. The first was I changed my party affiliation from Democrat to no party preference. I could no longer in good conscience be a registered Democrat, knowing what I knew then about how Democrats had created this problem. It's not a problem that you can blame on Republicans in a state with a supermajority Democrats. In San Francisco, I describe how Democrats had created the homelessness crisis, not just failed to act on it, actually actively made it worse. So I changed my party preference. And then I also founded the California Peace Coalition, which is comprised of parents of homeless drug addicts, parents of kids killed by fentanyl, and recovering addicts. And that coalition has been very active for the last year. We've done protests of open air drug dealing twice in San Francisco, once in Venice Beach, once in Sacramento, and it's been very effective in our advocacy. So definitely be leery of me. You should be leery of all candidates. But I think if you look at my record, you'll see somebody that has himself matured and has tried to take responsibility for my prior beliefs and prior actions. I've tried to do what I say I'm going to do. I've tried to be consistent with my views. And so when I realized I was wrong about these issues, it wasn't enough for me to just say I was wrong on Twitter. I wrote 2 books, that are 400 pages each with multiple endnotes that describe not just what I think is correct and what's incorrect, but also why I and other liberals got this issue wrong. And before I stop, I'll just say one thing, which is I think especially for people that are on the center right, it's hard to understand. Progressives have this huge blind spot, which is that progressives tend to think that if they're compassionate, if they're caring, if they're kind, that they can do no harm. And it turns out you can do huge amounts of harm, particularly to people with mental illness and drug addiction, by just helping, by just being compassionate. And so I even point out that the Jonestown, the Jim Jones cult that existed in San Francisco in the 70s that resulted in the Jonestown massacre, where almost 1,000 people were killed, where the expression drinking the Kool-Aid comes from, was a manifestation of how people got sucked into this idea that a group of people that ostensibly care so much about things like racial equity and charity could end up causing so much harm.
One of the things, if I could just chime in here, there are a lot of lot of current elected leaders who have had epiphanies about the things that positions they've had in the past. I've changed a little bit, probably not a lot, but I will say that Ronald Reagan at one time was a Democrat, and then he very eloquently stated that he did not leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left him. And more recently, Elon Musk made the same point on Twitter, showing how where he was in the political spectrum hasn't changed, but it's just that the political spectrum itself shifted dramatically to the left. And I think that's worth it. But again, we can talk all day about political labels, but Michael, as you know, we're looking for the real solutions to these very serious problems. And quite frankly, I don't think people really care that much about party label. I do know, our office, as you know, is 2 blocks from the state capitol. I know a lot of Democrats who are very serious and would like to bring real world solutions to it, and they're willing to work with Republicans who do the same. The problem is the political structure in California is you've got people in their silos, and it's very difficult for those people to reach across the aisle and have good discussions. It sometimes happens. There are things that can be done. We've seen it. We know when there's a crisis that people will react accordingly. But unfortunately, the political polarization, not just in California, but nationally, has been an impediment to this. And again, I think what we're looking for is people with real solutions.
Well, we have a question. This is kind of California specific. Laura wants to know, how can nuclear energy be made safe from earthquake risk?
Earthquakes. So nuclear power was, for me, one of the scariest things in the world. And I was 14 years old when the Chernobyl accident occurred in Ukraine. I was raised on nuclear, was sort of a secular devil in my family and for me. So I had to overcome a lot of fears of nuclear power. I remember actually when I was a boy, my sister said to me, "Can you believe they're building a nuclear plant on an earthquake fault in California?" It was the first time I ever heard of Diablo Canyon. And I remember thinking that if something happened, that it would result in nuclear war. Like, I actually had thought that nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons were basically the same thing, which I don't think is uncommon particularly among very liberal people and people that are pretty uneducated. That was certainly the case for me. So I've come a long way from where I was as a boy. I think it's worth pointing out. I mean, one thing we point out is that, Diablo Canyon nuclear plant is near an earthquake fault. That sounds scary until you realize that so much of California is near earthquake faults. Like, there's an earthquake fault that goes right by my house. When you look at a map of earthquake faults, we live on earthquake faults. So really everything we build in California is on earthquake faults. Diablo Canyon, I'm satisfied, has been built to such high earthquake standards, including with these 2 big containment domes, that I feel that, and I'm satisfied that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is such a high standard and is such an independent regulator that the plant is safe. The other issue about Diablo Canyon is that I've interviewed nuclear safety experts around the world. I interviewed one of them when I was getting involved in Diablo Canyon back in 2016. And he was very critical of the nuclear industry. He wrote a famous paper about Fukushima. And I said, Woody, what do you think of Diablo Canyon? And he said, great plant. And I was like, what makes you say that? He goes, well, it's so well run. And I was like, well, what makes it so well run? And he goes, well, the people there, they really care about the plant. And I remember at the time thinking it was such a bizarre thing to say. He was somebody who was a probabilistic risk expert, very sophisticated person in terms of the mathematics and the calculations. But at the end of the day, what inspired him about Diablo Canyon was so many people that work at the plant live nearby. And I've become friends with 2 of the women that started Mothers for Nuclear, Kristen Zaitz and Heather Hoff. Both have young children. They both live nearby. And it sounds corny, but I think that makes a big difference. Fukushima, there were a bunch of things that went wrong. But one of the things was the people that ran the plant weren't locals. and they were actually slightly scared of the locals. So this is in one of the great ironies. They failed to raise the seawall at Fukushima and which would have prevented the tsunami from breaching into the plant, because they were afraid of the local population being scared of the plant. Diablo Canyon has water that has been moved uphill. You can actually see in photographs of Diablo Canyon, there's these two pools of water uphill. So if there's a loss of coolant accident, they can run water over the plants. If there are other kinds of loss of coolant, you can pump water right from the ocean over the cores. So for me, Diablo is, one of the safest plants in the country, and earthquakes are just a reality that we all have to deal with. But I think it's, arguably one of the safest, if not the safest, building structures in California.
Well, we have a question about how you would attract businesses back to California. And I wonder if you could answer that by also talking about electricity costs in California and how your policies would make it potentially more affordable.
I want to open California back up to business. One of the things I'm looking forward to doing as governor is being able to literally call up CEOs and try to get them to come back. I mean, certainly one of the first calls I'll make will be to Elon Musk, come back to California. There's other CEOs we want to bring back here. There's nothing will be the same as actually directly hearing from the governor of the state that wants to bring you there. We know that the mayor of Miami does this. We know the governor of Florida does this. I think our leaders have taken advantage of how special California is, and they've taken businesses for granted, where I don't think we should do that. We know we're losing a lot of tech leaders to Florida, Texas, other states. We want to fight to bring those folks back. Another big part of it, obviously, is the homelessness crisis. I've described what we need to do to address the homeless crisis. But if you can't make your workforce feel safe walking to and from work, downtown San Francisco, the Twitter office is right in the middle of an open drug scene. It's an outrageous situation. I mean, I've taken 4 reporters now on walks through the downtown area that's dominated by these open air drug markets. We were 7 minutes into a walk. I was with the Times of London, and we found a guy overdosing on the street, a homeless guy. They rolled him out of his tent. His face was turning blue. This is not a safe environment. A 16-year-old girl the age of my daughter was raped, in that same area just very recently. She then was overdosed and dying. So I think you have to make our cities safe, livable, and walkable. Dealing with the open air drug scene is critical to that. And then electricity. I mean, you can't maintain particularly heavy industries in California if your electricity prices are going through the roof and you have regular blackouts. The governor announced that we may have our 4th year of blackouts in a row. This is ridiculous. The governor, every time something goes wrong, he looks around for somebody to blame. When he can't find somebody to blame, he blames climate change. That's ridiculous. California has been planning for climate change since the late 1980s. We just need more power plants. We have to stop shutting down power plants. We have to build more of them. That will be a huge priority of ours when we become governor. We saw our electricity prices rise 7 times more in California than they did in the rest of the United States over the last decade. All the metrics are going in the wrong direction. Homelessness increased 31% in California, even as it declined by 18% over the last decade. The only way the governor, who claims that homelessness is going up everywhere, the only way that claim is accurate is if you count California into the rest of the United States rather than separate it out. So those are at least 3 things we would do. Obviously, at some point, we'd love to get to some tax reform so we have a less insanely high taxes. But for now, tax peace so we can rescue our civilization and get back to normal, bring businesses back to California. I think the other issue is just this, the inequality we're seeing. We're chasing away the productive sectors of our economy. Water is obviously a huge issue in terms of agriculture. I just got off the phone with a major farmer from the Central Valley, from the Turlock region. And it's crazy that we don't have enough water after having approved $2.7 billion for water storage projects. The governor's doing a double game here. He's in the pocket of pro-scarcity environmentalists who want to make energy and water and housing scarce and expensive, while he's claiming that he's committed to, say, increasing housing to 500,000 units a year up from 100,000, claiming to support a desalination project, even though his own 4 commissioners on the California Coastal Commission voted against the desalination project. So he's playing a double game here so he can win their favor to run for president in 2024. I have mere ambitions. I would be so honored to be governor of California. That would be my sole and single focus, to serve the people of California. And that means bringing back businesses and making California open to business again.
So we have a question from Sarania about fire seasons. What would you do to improve the situation as far as wildfires are concerned?
So I'm passionate about forests. I'm very proud. I'm not embarrassed about everything I did in the 90s. It's worth asking, do I regret it all? I don't. One of the things I'm most proud of in the 90s is I helped to save Headwaters Forest, which is our last ancient redwoods in Humboldt County, about $500 million, and we saved somewhere around 10,000 acres of unprotected ancient redwood forest that people can go and visit and see for themselves. This is a national treasure that we have in California. I've also been obsessed with forest ecosystems. There's 2 chapters in Apocalypse Never about forests. To simplify, California has basically 2 kinds of forests. It has shrubland forests, like the coastal shrublands, like in Miami, in Malibu. And then we have the montane forests, so the mountain forests, like in the Sierra Nevadas. The shrubland forests are entirely ignition-driven fires. So higher temperatures does contribute, but the main reason we're having more fires in shrublands is just because we have more people, and more people brings more electrical wires, and we have underinvested in both undergrounding electrical wires and clearing the brush from around the wires to reduce fires. That's got to be a bigger priority, as well as suppressing those fires as soon as they start in the shrublands. In the mountain forests, the big event is just the accumulation of wood fuel on the forest floors. So climate change and warmer temperatures, it is expanding the fire season from basically 4 to 6 months a year to year round. But that doesn't mean that we're helpless to losing our beautiful Sierra forests. We know that a well-managed forest, with using both mechanical clearing to clear away the undergrowth and also prescribed burns, often a combination of the 2, can turn a high-intensity fire into a low-intensity fire. These are forest ecosystems that need fire, that had fire as part of the ecosystem regularly. And so you may remember President Trump, he said when he met with Gavin Newsom and Governor Brown, he said, you have to do what they do in Norway and rake the forests. It was inartfully put, but he wasn't wrong in the direction of his remarks. You have to maintain the forests, and that means that you have some periodic burning and mechanical clearing of the undergrowth. But we saw every summer, we saw high intensity fires arriving in well-managed forests, and they drop to the ground and become low-intensity fires. So we're not doomed because of climate change to have high-intensity fires that then turn our mountain forests into shrubland forests. But we need to put significantly more money into that. I don't know if John mentioned before I got on the call, I'm in favor of completely defunding this ridiculous high-speed rail. There's other things that need more money, like we should have the money going to better forest management, so we're not choking smoke and losing our forests every year. It just requires people. We traditionally used prisoners for much of that. We would pay to have prisoners come and do that labor. But certainly if we do Cal Psych, a lot of those Cal Psych workers recovering from addiction could do temporary work in Cal Fire. So we'd want a Cal Psych, Cal Fire relationship in the same way we might already have a corrections relationship to Cal Fire.
Okay, we have a question about the surplus and how it could be refunded to taxpayers and how you would do that. And I just want to point out that you're on this call with John Coupal, who is the state's leading expert on the GAN limit and the requirements of the law and the state constitution about refunding it. So perhaps the 2 of you could talk a little bit about what the options are and where you stand on that.
Well, then I'm going to let John go first to respond to this, because I actually would love to hear John respond to the issue of the GAN limit. I'm something I've been paying a lot of attention to.
Right. In the year after Proposition 13 in 1978, the voters of the state of California passed the GAN spending limit, which was quite a simple concept, and that is you limit government spending at both the local and statewide level to population and inflation. And you kept government static at that size giving the voters the option to override the GAN spending limit for a period of no more than 4 years that was written into the Constitution. Unfortunately, subsequent to that, various interests from both the right and the left weakened the GAN spending limit. So now the growth limit is much higher, and also there are restrictions on what can be done with the surplus. So you'll see that there is this talk of a $97 billion surplus, but the reality is it's more about 49 billion in discretionary funds, because the rest of it is dedicated to two things: schools, by virtue of something called Prop 98, and a rainy day fund, also called the budget stabilization account. So the surplus isn't as big as they say, and not only that, the legislative analyst, Gabe Pettick, who, by the way, we have a great deal of respect for the California's legislative analyst because he's a straight shooter, but he points out that even with the surplus in the out years, 2024, 25, that because of some of the legal requirements, California will actually start losing money for every dollar it gains. It's committed to spend more money than it takes in. And so it's a ratcheting effect that if the law isn't changed, it will result in fiscal chaos. We're already in fiscal chaos, quite frankly. But I think in my discussions with Michael, he agrees with us that one of the responses, and fortunately, Governor Newsom did say that he would dedicate more money to the budget stabilization account, which is a good thing. You've got to, when he does the right thing, you've got to call him out on it. But perhaps more robust appropriations into the budget stabilization account. But more fundamentally is we need to be spending more on debt reduction, the unfunded mandates for pension obligations. That is a easy way to avoid bumping up the GAN spending limit, that is to pay down debt. So, Michael, I'm not sure I just articulated your policy on.
Yeah, perfectly. Well, I did my homework, and I was reading the LAO report. And indeed, if you get to the end of it, they say, under our assessment of the governor's May revision, the state would face a roughly 25 billion budget problem next year. Setting aside additional reserves now would help mitigate that problem. So that makes good sense. I mean, the issue, as everybody knows, with our taxes is that it's just so top heavy in relying on upper income earners that if we go into recession and have a bad year next year, we could be in deficits. So it makes a lot of sense to me that we would put more money into the rainy day fund.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's change topics here and talk about school choice. And while we're talking about school choice, tell us what you think about school funding in California. There's talk of changing the attendance-based rules for how the schools are funded. What can you tell us about your views about school funding and school choice in California?
Sure, and let me say too, my apologies again for hopping on late. I'm happy to stay longer. I can certainly go much longer after the call if people want to hang on.
That's fine.
Because I know we got started later. So I'm a huge believer in school choice. I say this as someone who both my mother and my stepfather were public school teachers. My mom was a union rep. I believe in good teachers. I also know that nobody hates bad teachers more than good teachers. I don't think that teacher tenure is necessary in the same way that tenure is necessary for university professors, where you're trying to protect freedom of expression and freedom of inquiry. That being said, of course, the teachers union is a political reality that we're going to have to negotiate and deal with. But for me, it seems pretty straightforward. We've had a revolution in personalizing almost every aspect of our lives, certainly healthcare, but so much else. But we haven't had the personalization revolution in education. We need to be able to personalize education for kids. This has sometimes been disparaged as tracking, but I think that's a bad way to think about it because it implies a hierarchy of values rather than just kids getting the kind of education they need. I think we've underthought and invested in proper vocational education. I'm inspired by what they do in Germany with the Mittelstand, which is this sort of mid-sized manufacturing sector of the economy, which is why they make the best chainsaws, for example, continually. but they have a really robust apprenticeship program. We haven't done enough of that, in my view. At the same time, we can see that the governor's people are waging war on meritocracy. Kids, instead of dealing with these terrible racial disparities, 10% African-American math proficiency on average in LA public schools, 15% Latino proficiency in LA public schools. Meanwhile, just 33% math proficiency overall in public schools. Instead of dealing with the racial disparities, they're now looking at preventing all children from getting algebra before high school. This is ridiculous. I mean, how are we going to compete with China and Russia and globally with Europe if we're undereducating our kids? The poor student performance, these are civilization ending numbers, and they only got worse. I mean, nothing makes me and other parents more furious than realizing that Governor Newsom was sending his own kids to private school for in-classroom instruction in the 2020-2021 school year, while he kept all of our kids at home. Meanwhile, I have a lot of friends in Europe. I really respect Europe. The Europeans sent their kids back for in-classroom instruction in 2020. And when you listen to the governor and you listen closely to what he's saying, he says, well, we'll try to make up for it with summer instruction. The only way to deal with these disparities and these differences is to have greater school choice. School choice is wildly popular. It's always been wildly popular. What we've needed is for voters to feel passionate about it. I've been blown away by how passionate voters and parents are about it. There's like a huge number of parents on Twitter and social media. They've been pushing me to speak out on it more. I have been speaking out on it more. It's never enough for them. I can't blame them. It's a huge issue. The evidence is very strong. When there's competition between schools perform better. There's some questions that have to be worked out, such as, do private schools participate in this? Do they, and if so, what kind of accreditation do you have? There has been an effort to put school choice on the ballot. It didn't make the ballot this year. I expect it will make the ballot in 2024. Certainly many of our supporters are the same supporters of school choice. As governor, I will campaign for that. We'll see if we can get it done through the legislature, but assuming we can't, we'll still do that citizens jury to allow that consensus to be built. Because you got to remember that we're in a really different environment now. Like, the newspaper editorial boards don't matter as much as, say, a Howard Jarvis endorsement, because social media is able to amplify these endorsements in a new media environment. Similarly, when we do this, when we're building public consensus around a new vision on education, a new vision on energy, water, housing, when we're building support for Cal Psych, we're going to be able to build it over time with these citizen juries, so that if and when the teachers union, and I don't want to assume the teachers union is going to be a problem. It might be that they will come around to our view, but if they don't, we will build support among the public for this agenda, so that by the time it does go to the legislature, we've built a significant majority support for what we need to do. Or when we go to the ballot in 2024, there's strong public support for it. We've built up a base of donors who can support that ballot initiative against what we know would be tens of millions of dollars potentially in opposition from the teachers union. So all that's to say, not only do I support school choice, I'm going to fight for it. I believe in it. I want it for my own daughter. I want it for my own kids. And I've been thinking a lot about, how do we get it done? It's not enough. I'm not interested in just being right or being correct. We want to succeed. We want when we're governor, we want it to be a transformative 8 years in office. We don't want it to be like the Schwarzenegger administration, which did many good things, don't get me wrong, but ultimately had to just govern with the status quo because they hadn't really thought through how to lead the state with a really transformative agenda.
So let me ask you about an issue that many people are asking about in our chat. Tell me about crime policy and also about prisons. The governor is talking about closing more state prisons. Is that the right policy? Would you do that?
No, it's terrible. I mean, you have to, we went really far in one direction. We had a huge number of people in prison. I think the peak was close to 200,000. But when Governor Newsom came into office, there were in January 2019, there were 128,000 people in prison. Now there's 98,000 people in prison. And he says he wants to reduce the prison population by another 77,000. So you're talking about basically having just 20 or 30,000 people in prison for a state of 40 million. That's scary. I mean, one of the changes that we've seen in the open drug scenes, Skid Row, Tenderloin. I was just in West Oakland today with my colleague interviewing people. There's a significant number of formerly incarcerated people out there. They're not getting the support they need, I'll put it that way, to be following the law. We see laws being broke all the time. There's different kinds of lawbreakers. There are some share of criminals who are hardcore sociopaths and violent. They need to be in prison, and they need to be in prison until they age out, or if their crimes are heinous enough, they need to be in prison for life. I just think that's basic to protecting your society. There's another set of prisoners that can be rehabilitated. You know, people don't realize that California was the state that pioneered rehabilitation as our approach to criminal justice, starting in the 40s. An incredible history. So we've always been committed to that. We need to retain that commitment. But what's occurred under this governor and under the past governor is, honestly, it's just bonkers. I mean, my understanding when I was working on progressive criminal justice reform in the 1990s was that there were some people who were just addicts. They were just drug addicts. They were not sociopathic, violent criminals. The vast majority of people on the street are just sick with addiction or mental illness. They need rehab or psychiatric care as an alternative to incarceration. But then you need to have a system whereby we know they're getting the reforms they need. I mentioned briefly housing earned. There should be universal shelter, even if you don't believe in it morally, which I do. The Supreme Court has required now that you have sufficient shelter before you can enforce anti-camping laws. The Supreme Court upheld a decision out of Boise. But what we know works with addicts is housing contingent for abstinence. So the classic example, these were case studies. This was research done in Birmingham, Alabama with crack addicts, where they would get basic shelter, but if they wanted their own private room, their own private apartment, they'd have to pass a drug test. They pass a drug test, and then they can go and get their own room. They fail the drug test, they go back to congregate housing. That's a probationary strategy. So I always point out, if you're not going to have mass incarceration, but you don't want mass homelessness and crime, then you need the 3 key Ps: more police, more psychiatry, more probation. Police are just good. I mean, this will sound obvious to all of you who are on the political right, but for liberals, police are good. I mean, this demonization of the police that's occurred is really sad and pathetic and wrong. And we're now short 500 police officers at a minimum in San Francisco. We're short 700 police officers at a minimum in Los Angeles. We've got these extremely generous pensions for police officers. You can't make their pensions more generous. The salaries are pretty high, but we've just demoralized and de-inspired a whole generation of police. It's not a high status activity. I want to re-inspire them. I want to support them, attract police officers back to the police force. Police prevent crime. So if you're against mass incarceration, then you should want more police. We also then need to do more probationary activities, more drug testing, more electronic monitoring, and more unannounced visits to require people to stay on the straight and narrow after they get out of prison. What they're doing now, the Soros-funded prosecutors, Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, George Gascon in Los Angeles, but Soros, of course, also gave $1 million to Gavin Newsom. I think it's a big part of the reason why Gavin is in such a hurry to let people out of prison, despite the surge in crime that we've seen, 30% increase in homicides, huge increase in things like car break-in, theft, boosting, which is shoplifting done by homeless addicts. These things are occurring because there is like a competition between Soros-funded politicians for just letting people out of jail, letting people de-incarcerating willy-nilly. That's absurd. We need to put an end to it. We're going to have a law and order agenda, but we don't want to go back to this exaggerated over incarceration. We want to really achieve a better balance between this crazy agenda that Gavin Newsom is pursuing from the mass incarceration agenda that we had in the 1990s.
Okay, while we're on the subject of courts, I want to ask you another question about judges, and I'd like to bring John back into this discussion. we've been aware at Howard Jarvis that the courts have not been ruling in what we think is a manner consistent with the state constitution on some of these tax issues. And I wonder, John, can you explain a little bit about what we're concerned about? And Michael, can you address how you would appoint judges and what you'd look for?
Yeah, I mean, the problem we've had, and by the way, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, we have 2 full-time litigators in addition to myself. I am a recovering attorney, as they say, and we at one time were winning at least half of our cases enforcing Proposition 13 and enforcing another initiative that we sponsored in 1996 called the Right to Vote on Taxes Act. Regrettably, virtually all the judges coming up from both Governor Brown and Governor Newsom have been progressive activists. And when we argue cases in court, all we're looking for is a fair shake. Apply the law to the facts. That's all we want. They should not have a political agenda. A judge's job, in our view, is to simply call balls and strikes. We have seen a complete perversion of the plain language of both Prop 13 and the Right to Vote on Taxes Act, Prop 218, in a manner that's going to result in the next 2 years of fairly significant tax increases at the local level. So, that's all we're looking for in terms of our judges, is someone who are smart lawyers, hopefully with trial experience, who knows what it's like to be, in the courtroom and not in academia, real world experience to resolve these cases. And by the way, resolve the horrific backlog of cases that are currently backed up in our superior courts. Michael.
And
Yeah,
before Michael answers, can you just briefly explain what the Upland decision was and why that's going to result in local tax increases?
Yeah, I just alluded to it a little bit, and that is Proposition 13 for 40 years and Prop 218 requires a 2/3 vote for local special taxes. The California Supreme Court and several courts of appeal have opened the door to simple majority vote special taxes. And so you've seen that in San Francisco. Michael's talked quite a bit about San Francisco, but there are now 3 or 4 already imposed taxes. And again, it's driving businesses out of the city and also substantially increasing the cost of home ownership in San Francisco. Other local jurisdictions in more conservative areas don't have this problem. But if you're in any major area, I know Sacramento's considering one as well. Remember, under Prop 13, just regular property taxes, we rank 14th out of 50 states in per capita property tax collections. There's enough revenue there, and we don't need to give citizens of the state of California another excuse to move to Tennessee or to Texas or to the Carolinas.
Yeah, I was going to say the exact you took the words right out of my mouth, which was that we should leave legislating to legislators. That's not the role of judges. This is completely unacceptable and outrageous, the amount of activist judges that we've seen, and ditto on the taxes as well. I mean, I have to say, I think there's a lot of benefits, obviously, to the surplus. But the one thing I think it shows is that we're overtaxed. I mean, the taxes are already too darn high, and so I think you're in a very hard case for progressives, so-called progressives, to make that we need to yet have more taxes or more fees that they disguise, more taxes they disguise as fees, given the really high rate of taxation and the huge surpluses that we've been generating.
So let me ask you a question about the state of emergency in California. We're still under a state of emergency for COVID-19. Would you end that?
Yes.
And would you impose a state of emergency for any other reason?
We may need to take some executive actions to deal with the humanitarian disaster of homelessness, but very judiciously, very carefully, in a very limited way. We want to get California back to normal. We want to end the governor went way too far. This thing has been going on way too long. Look, I was a COVID alarmist. There's still people on Twitter that that share a tweet that I put out in March of 2020, where I was citing the models showing the danger of the pandemic. The time to be an alarmist is at the beginning of a pandemic. Well, the coronavirus has turned into endemic. We now know the coronavirus, it's becoming even more contagious, and less deadly. It's actually Omicron. We should all be grateful for Omicron. There's a conspiracy theory out there that Omicron was genetically engineered in order to create herd immunity. Without speculating on conspiracy theories, since some of them may end up being true, like the one out of the lab leak, whatever the case may be, it's basically the pandemic is ending the way that everybody expected it would, which is that we're all getting hurt. We have herd immunity. We're getting herd immunity. We're all going to get COVID. I can't even tell if I might have had it. I'm triple vaxxed, by the way. I'm a big believer in vaccines, but I wouldn't ever impose coronavirus vaccines on anybody. I don't believe in vaccine mandates for coronavirus. I don't believe in mask mandates. It's absurd. They went on way too long. It became a form of virtue signaling. It may be that in order to deal with the humanitarian disaster that we call homelessness, where women are being sexually assaulted multiple times, trapped in their addiction and open drug scenes, drug dealers killing thousands of our people every year, there may be a limited number of executive orders that we're going to need to take, but it certainly wouldn't be mass executive orders or mass emergency orders like we saw with coronavirus.
Okay, well, let me ask you just to kind of wrap up here. How can people help your campaign? We had one volunteer contact us and say, are there yard signs? Are there banners? What can people do to help your campaign?
We need donations. We need your money. That is the most important thing right now, you guys. The good news is we've done very well on fundraising. I think we've raised close to $800,000. All money, the campaign is all paid for. We've got we've got exactly 3 weeks. Every dollar that comes into the campaign goes right into advertising, into voter contacts. If Twitter were the real world, we would have won the election already. I wish Twitter were the real world. It's not. A lot of people are not on Twitter. We need to go out there and run ads on television. So we need money. We love yard signs. I think that we are in the process of, if not already, of contracting with some company where you can buy a yard sign, buy bumper stickers from them. But the truth of the matter is we just need donations. And people say it sounds cliche, but it's totally accurate. Any amount of money helps. $10, $25, $100. The maximum contribution is $32,400. So if you can afford those levels of donations, those are welcome. But please, any amount of money helps. It's not just about, and I should say we're extremely happy with the sheer number of donations that we've received, not just the size of them. So really any amount of money helps. Certainly being on social media, spreading the word. We know word of mouth works. We've had a whole bunch of people that stay on social media. I've been telling all my friends and family, all my neighbors to vote for you, and we got all your votes. So all of that will help us to really come in second on June 7th.
And what's the website?
Sorry. The website,
The website.
The first lesson of being a candidate, give the website.
You can tell us so Shellenbergerforgovernor.com.
And
Great.
Shellenberger is spelled
Shellenberger. And I was looking at the chat on the Zoom. A lot of these questions I've answered. My email is michaelschellenberger@gmail.com. I genuinely answer every substantive email I get, or I have one of the members of the campaign team answer. If you have a question that we haven't answered, it's almost certainly the case that we will answer it on the website or somewhere else. There's some of the questions that people are asking that are more federal than state, like such as on immigration policy. If we had more time, I'd certainly be delighted to talk about my views of immigration, but a lot of these issues are more federal, but a lot of them, I think people will be able to find the answers on the website.
Okay. John, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining in. I think this has been very instructive, and I think after hearing what Michael has to say, you understand why our political action committee endorsed him. Again, it gets down to anyone who wants someone in office who can speak seriously on these issues and not just be superficial understands why we endorse them. So please give them your support. The election day is coming up really soon, and we hope no matter what happens, he stays in the fray and continues to provide guidance and counsel to all of California. And we really wish more people would listen to what he has to say, because the problems we have are large, but they're not intractable. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you again, John. Thank you, Susan. Thank you again
Thank
for the
you.
endorsement. It was my pleasure.
Thank you,
Take
Michael.
care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody, for watching.
I think that's it.